Thank you, and thank you, I should say more broadly, to the PA family, who are a valued corporate partner of Reforms, and for hosting us and putting us up today. The team have encouraged me to remind you that at 4 o'clock after this, refreshments at the back will be replenished, and there's plenty of time for people to kind of hang around and mingle and ask that person that question you wish you had got a chance to, but forgot. As I said, my name's Joe Hill. I'm part of the team at the Reform think tank. I'm a policy director and I lead our work on kind of civil service reform in Whitehall. We're really grateful to be joined here today by Professor Angela McLean. Angela is the Government Chief Scientific Advisor and formerly the Ministry of Defence's Chief Scientific Advisor as well. We're very lucky to have her with us. We wanted to put on this kind of conversation today and now because it feels like a really timely point. You know, we live in a world which is kind of ever more fast changing, ever quicker to evolve, and ever more complicated, and feels like science has an even more important role to play in helping policymakers in Westminster understand the kind of challenges and opportunities that they have to grapple with on a daily basis. But you know, science is never kind of complete and finished, and is a changing field led by people who are changing their understanding of what they're doing. And so it's also a really good opportunity to reflect on kind of the state of the government scientific community and what it's doing and how it's changing to address the needs of a kind of changing policy environment. We are going to run this as a kind of in conversation, and I'm going to start with just a kind of chair's privilege, use a few of my own questions, then we'll kind of go open it up to the audience to get kind of views from the room, and I'll talk a bit more about how we'll do that when we get there. I guess, kind of Angela, I was going to kind of come to you with a sort of broad question, first of all, which is, you know, we do live in this increasingly kind of complicated world, and the way that the government, the state as a whole kind of has to manage that is changing too. What do you see your role as the Government Chief Scientific Advisor in that being, and kind of the role of the whole profession of government scientists as well?
So there's a very short answer to that, which is that my role is to make sure there is excellent science advice at the heart of government decision making. And that's something I do with a whole network of Chief Scientific Advisors, Paul Monks from Desmond is here, CSA there. So every government department has a Chief Scientific Advisor, most of them externals, and of those mostly scientists from universities, mixture of natural scientists and behavioural scientists. And also we have a couple of scientists from industry. We did have one from finance. Until we finished this time recently. So a great mix of people and a very strong network. The other people who help with, help deliver that are our offices. So the Government Office for Science supports that, particularly for work that's required across government. Every CSA will have a supporting cast of various sizes, so that they're different bits of government have sort of different amount of effort going into doing their science. And then, of course, there are actually thousands of civil servants who are scientists, either people who started as scientists and came in often through the fast stream, have become very mainstream civil servants, but then also, we have all sorts of very specialist bits of science capability around the house. And in fact, one of the things I'm very keen to do is to get more of those people to come and work right in the heart of Whitehall, learn all the tricks of the trade of actually being a civil servant, which is a profession in its own right, and in the hopes of driving more science right into the sort of, right into the heart of decision making, so that maybe one day we wouldn't be necessary. I think we're very necessary at the moment because there's rather little science capability in the civil service.
It's an interesting kind of model and thought that one day you might want to kind of invent yourselves out of this particular role.
Well, I don't think Singapore. Well, you go to Korea. You sit down with, you sit down with a government minister. You have a conversation. You're talking about risk. Suddenly you think, oh, this person actually knows that a probability can't be bigger than 1. That's different, and I don't think they have a science advisory system. There are many ways you can do it, Other places do it by bringing in ministers from outside, sort of en masse. I know current government has just done that, I think very successfully. So there are lots of ways you can do it. The way we do it, with our tremendous emphasis on the benefits of the generalist, I think does require specialist advice.
I guess the tension there is sometimes between, as you put it, the kind of specialists, be they scientific specialists or other kinds of specialists in policy making, and the kind of generalist model that's kind of dominated the way we set up the civil service. We wrote a report a little over a year ago with Professor John Aston, who was a chief scientific advisor at the Home Office and now has returned to academia, which we sort of titled From Sideline to Systemic, and we talked about a kind of journey to put scientific advice, as you put it, right at the heart of policy making. We set out a set of recommendations in that, including, wanting all government chief scientists to be director general level appointments in the civil service rather than sometimes more junior appointments, and a set of other recommendations. I mean, we were trying to describe a journey. I guess, where do you feel like we're on in that journey and from putting this really at the heart of why, and maybe what's next?
So I think the journey to having an externally appointed DG level CSA in every department, we're probably about halfway there, I should think. Most departments now have an externally appointed one, bar I think it's probably about 4. And the majority of DGs, but not all. Maybe it might be slightly more than half. So you put those two things together, I'd say we're halfway to, but that's halfway to being up to strength. Then, I mean, I don't think the end of the journey. The director of Go Science and I have this joke that when he gives the eulogy at my funeral, he will say, well, of course, now half the perm sex are scientists, and that's what Angela wanted. I'm planning to live a long time. so there might be time. I mean, that would be, I think that would, I don't think all the perm sex should be scientists for one moment. But I think it seems odd to me that we shut out the sort of half of the expertise that is, and I mean science really, I mean science and engineering, writ large, science, engineering, all the clinical backgrounds. Science, I would always include behavioural science. It's just odd, isn't it, that those people aren't running the department. None of those people are running those departments. There's one head of department who's a second engineer.
To maybe talk about some areas where this kind of might be particularly relevant or not, I guess if we wind the clocks back 5 years ago, we were in the midst of the pandemic, or the very beginnings of the pandemic in some ways. There were calls, and I think it was a moment when the role of science in policy making kind of stepped out on the world stage in a way it maybe hasn't done before. And there were very kind of political calls being made about science, and if I were to sum it up, the kind of most powerful political force at the time seemed to be that we should follow the science. I'm interested in, and maybe it's reflection on then, now, on the future, but kind of how do we move from a sense of science which is based on kind of scientific consensus to one which also recognises scientific uncertainty in policy making. Uncertainty is not something that policymakers always want to hear, but it is an important part of the model on the worldview.
So I think that's the great strength of the scientific method. That's why it can claim to be a particular kind of truth, is that we have these two things, namely, if I believe something, I'm going to tell you what I did in order to make myself believe it, and you should be able to do exactly the same thing and get the same answer, and if you don't, there's a problem. I mean, actually, aside, there is a problem, but we'll come to that later. And that makes it different from, a whole bunch of normative statements about this is the right thing to do. Many of them, values-driven, good, useful statements. But I think this idea that there are some things where certain statements actually are wrong is or very clearly not compatible with repeatable experiments that we can do. That's just tremendously useful for us, and it saves a lot of time, and you can sort of say, no, don't do that, actually, no, it won't work. And actually one of my predecessors, Bob May, one of the things he says, quite often it's difficult to tell people what will work, but it's often a lot easier to tell them what won't work.
Okay, so a more kind of via negative approach to some of these things.
Ooh, is that a foreign language?
Not mine, certainly. we've referenced a few times in our research things from your evidence to the COVID inquiry, which I think has been really powerful and is great as an aside on the kind of whole inquiry to have such a body of work about how the innermost workings of Whitehall at a time when we were making really big, difficult policy decisions. And one of the things I thought was really interesting in what you said is about how standards of kind of challenge and robustness in government varied a bit compared to your experience in the academic community. I don't have the exact words in front of me, but you were kind of trying to make the point that in government it can be uncomfortable to challenge someone really directly and say, I just don't agree with what you're saying. I'm interested, that was, you're talking about a period now a few years ago, and you're in a different job. Do you think that's changing?
No, not at all. And that's not a COVID-specific observation, although it was part of my COVID experience. So the two phrases that I would contrast were, I agree with everything that's been said. That's an absolutely standard statement. If you go to any meeting of civil servants, the sort of, it's sort of, I think people say it without even thinking about it. And the contrasting one that I would give is, tell me why I'm wrong. Which was a phrase we used a lot in SPI-M, the bit of COVID advisory work where I was most involved. And they are actually different ways of working together. When I was, so before COVID, so when I was new in the civil service, so I was CSA in the MOD, you get sort of put in a cohort of your peers. And I was completely, I was completely perplexed by this. Why are they saying I agree with everything that's been said? Because I cannot imagine an academic situation where that would be said. And I used to joke in MOD that the true translation of that is, I haven't bothered to listen to what you said, and now I'm going to tell you what I think. Because you do, I mean, if you want to disagree with somebody, you do actually have to listen to them, right, in order to make some sense. It was explained to me, so in this pre-COVID conversation with my peers, it was explained to me, remember what we civil servants are doing really is delivery. And in order to do delivery, we absolutely have to cohere. And sometimes being cohesive is more important than thrashing out every single last bit of exactly what is correct. Now those words, but it's quite hard for me to say those words, because delivering something that's incorrect could well cause you an awful lot of trouble, right? But, now let me tell you the other side of this story. I was at an evening seminar earlier this week, and it might have been the first time I've been to a science seminar, maybe for 5 years, that might be possible. And I was absolutely shocked at how rude they were. So I've sort of gone native. I've become a civil servant. I mean, academics are pretty rude to each other, but don't take it personally. And that, I mean, there is some, and that can cause some trouble at the boundaries. So academics can think that civil servants have absolutely believed everything they said, because they say to them, I agree with everything you say. But that it sort of means something. It means like kind of I like you and I'll work with you. And a civil servant can wade in and say, well, I think you're wrong for the following reasons, in ways that feels extremely rude sorry, other way around. An academic can say, here's why I think you're wrong, in ways that feels rather rude in civil service. So I think, I mean, there are cultural differences there that I think we all have to be very aware of. And there must be ways we can get richness out of those two, actually. Get some of the best of both.
And is there a starting point to doing that, or something you think works? Maybe it's just a form of language and a challenge that tell me how I'm wrong.
I think it's making time.
Making time.
It takes time to disagree with each other. It takes time. If you disagree with somebody, you have to really have paid attention to what they're saying, and you then need to. Well, if somebody says, I disagree with you, you can either say, I don't care, or you can try and figure out, well, what is it that we're disagreeing about? And that will tend to take more time, and academics will take as long as it takes. That is the beauty of being an academic job, but that's not always available when you need to deliver things. So, but I do think some of the stuff we do, we need to take more time. we live that in Go Science by having meetings with smaller numbers of people in them, with fewer things on the agenda. On the basis that that's what's required if you actually want to have a real discussion.
It's a good set of norms to follow. I'm sure there are plenty of bits outside of the kind
Depends
of
on what you want. You know, if you don't want a discussion, then have a packed full agenda where all people can do is come and read their lines a day. It's efficient. It's a complete waste of time. Very funny when people read the wrong lines.
No doubt. One thing which it kind of feels like a perennial problem in policy making is standards and expectations around kind of evidence, evaluation, and the rigour that's applied to things after the fact. You know, a lot of policy making can be driven by a news cycle, announcements, the desire to get something out the door, and then you come to the next time you want to announce something about that, and you think, how on earth are we doing, and is it going well, and is it not? Some of that is not evidence in the way that sort of scientific establishment would do evidence and analysis, and some of it is. I guess, is there something the rest of the policy-making community can learn, or where do you see the kind of the fault lines and the differences?
No, I think there's a lot. I think a lot of CSAs would say, yes, I spend actually quite a lot of my time saying, I don't think this is a good metric because it's not repeatable, or you haven't standardised how you're going to measure it, or oh gosh, I mean, actually I must find out from my colleagues. It is not uncommon for me to be shown something, shown some piece of experimental work, offered evaluation, and I look at it and I say, oh, but there's no control, or oh, but there's no replicates. And and they say, yeah, and I'm, well, you won't be able to tell anything. And I think those are things where if you have a science training in which I would include a strong analytic training, you just see that instantly. You look at it and say, well, hang on, I guess what's the first thing you look for? The first thing you look for is, where's the control? Is it a reasonable control? And then the second thing you look at is, and how many replicas are there? It's that training, I think it would be good if we could get it wider across the piece, in order that everybody sees the nightmare of running an experiment or an evaluation and coming out a few months later and realising you can't learn anything from it because you designed it back into science.
Is that kind of, where should the burden of doing that kind of hard, frustrating work be? It sounds like it's not something entirely for the scientific community to kind of drive in Whitehall. You want other people kind of take up that mantle of leadership.
I think the scientists, the analysts, the policy makers, the policy professionals, I would start with those three.
Something which might help them, and just sort of moving on, we were talking a bit about kind of contrasting what's going on in the university research system and the kind of government scientific establishment. And certainly, I think on both sides of that, there's a lot of interest at the moment in the field of kind of meta-science and how can we, the science of science, how can we do scientific research better, and the extent to which different kind of models of doing that research might be more valuable. I would say there's a lot more kind of policy-making focus on doing that in kind of UKRI, REA, these big kind of grant funding programs. But I think it is also a question for government scientists. And I'm interested in what do you think you're learning about the way that science is done in government, ways to make it better? What should we take from kind of that ecosystem of thinking?
So I would say that the way science is done in government is a lot more adventurous and risk-taking than I had expected. And I don't know if that's because it's become so, remember, because I did sort of dabble around the edges of government science for quite a long time. So I think government science has got much more thoughtful about sort of actively being risk-taking. And when I say risk-taking, I don't mean stupid. I mean, going for high mean, high variance possibilities. That's the whole R of this, right? I mean, to give you an answer to a slightly different question, I think the super exciting thing coming round the corner, well, it's here already in science, is science done with AI. So we have DeepFold. If any of you get a chance to listen to Chris Bishop from Microsoft Research in Cambridge, talk about, what is coming for the bits of science where the physics models are good enough to generate synthetic data for you. There's just a ton of things. So we've got AlphaFold, we've already got much better weather forecasting, and there's a ton of things coming that I think in the next 5 years there will just be astonishing advances, but only in the things where we don't actually need to gather any more data, because the underlying models are so good that the synthetic data is good enough to train AI models on. And then there's the other super interesting thing about, well, what else, when we have to gather data, how should we organise ourselves to do it? Because I mean, after all, AlphaFold is very much an AI triumph. It is an AI triumph built on 40 years of collective effort to gather, standardise and store data in a way that an AI model could be built. What should we do that for next?
It sounds like you're talking about a model where AI is going to lead to sort of slightly lopsided returns in different scientific fields, depending a bit on where the starting point is, the conditions, have you got the fundamental models in the right place, and the data collection. Does that feel fair to say that?
I don't think it's any more lopsided than science already is lopsided. I'm going to really piss off all the physicists now. So, physics, well, the study of easy things, right? But, I mean, lots of bits of physics, I think will change. And the obvious ones are weather forecasting, I guess. But then there are other things where, although we have the physical models, actually you still have to do a lot of trial and error experimentation. I don't know if you've visited any of the places where they work on the new formulations for how you're going to make really nice hair conditioner when it's not a petrochemical based product anymore. Massive important question. And it turns out you can't just run a physics model and decide what to make and then make it. Even though it's not like they're large molecules or anything. I think that's really interesting. So I think I think basically there's a super interesting sort of two-sided intellectual problem. One is to decide how shall we arrange ourselves so it doesn't take 40 years to gather the next body of data we need, and what is the combination of people and robots that will actually gather that data. And I don't know the answers to either of those, but I think that's going to be just such an exciting time.
And in your background, you said you'd kind of dabbled around government research a bit before you kind of came into government. You've got an audience including people from the university ecosystem, from government science, from kind of a whole gamut. Again, we were talking a bit about this before, but what would you say to your colleagues who are still working in universities who are kind of facing into this system about how to work with it, how to engage it, how to have really good impact?
So I'd say there are many models of how to engage. So you don't have to be a CSA, which is it's a 7-day-a-week job for which you get 4 days a week. You can. There are many ways of doing it. So people can come and be interns for a while. People can sit on science advisory councils, which is sort of 20-day-a-year kind of a job. Or you can come and do the real thing and actually become a civil servant. All those are possible, and I think many people should try. One of the things that people say to me is, "Oh, but nobody really interested in my very particular recherche bit of animal evolution or something." And I then tell them this story about, well, actually, the main thing you'll be saying is there's no control on your experiment. It's more about learning how to see where in that bit of policy a piece of science is absolutely fundamental and missing. And you don't learn that in university, so you have to come here and learn how to do that. And that's a very interesting thing to do, and that you will find yourself working amongst a set of people whose values are very similar to yours, although their habits of work and language are very different from yours. And if you want to try something different, personally, I think it's one of the most interesting jobs going, being a CSA. Having done both the CSA role, one of the CSA roles and a GCSA role, I had done lots of science advisory work beforehand, where basically you come sort of 4 times a year for a couple of days. Also very interesting, very varied depending on which department you're facing into, because of course I think that's one of the things that you learn as an outsider as you get to know Whitehall is, my goodness, the departments are different. I didn't even know that they had different pay scales. I mean, how weird is that?
Absolutely, I'm sure many people in the room will have horror stories of different pay scales, cutting one way or the other, maybe. I guess final question from me then, and we'll kind of open it up. So please, if you haven't got a question in mind, start thinking of one now. But if the civil service is going to get people to do what you'd like them to do, come in and work as scientists in government, are there ways you'd like it to change that it hasn't? You talked about language, you talked about ways of working. There's maybe kind of possibilities there, but I'm curious if there are any others.
Well, this is nothing new. It's been around for a while, and it's called porosity. And we just need to really keep working to make porosity work. We have a name for it. I think, in all honesty, there's still a lot to do, should we say. It is pretty hard to enter the civil service mid-career. And that my sense is that the schemes where people can leave and then come back are better. But I think we just need much more. We need more of that. I often used to say in the MOD. So in the MOD, we would talk about how we just need to train a whole load of people up in order to understand what this AI thing is, and then they would say, oh yeah, but they'd all leave, which was probably true. And I used to point out that is the working model of university. You take people at 21, you hire them for 3-4 years as PhD students, you pay them almost nothing. They work all the hours that God gave and are completely fantastic, and they know they can't stay. The great majority of them won't stay. And frankly, quite a lot of them, after they leave, sort of think, was I being taken for a trip there? But it works incredibly well. You have a sort of very pyramid-shaped structure. I would love to see us do more of that, if we can. So more, I think particularly with modern ways of working with AI, which is sort of, borderline science, I would say let's do it the sciencey way, so we know when it's right and when it's wrong. But one of our ambitions for Go Science is that it will be the place that you come to learn how to become a brilliant bureaucrat who knows how to use AI well, and then hopefully you go off and become a brilliant bureaucrat in other bits of the civil service. And even if you don't, if it's, again, one of the things we used to say in the MOD is, well, if actually we need friends outside the MOD. We need people who understand how we work, have some sympathy for us, and are working in other bits of the sort of sciencey ecosystem.
Well, look, that's I think a great note to not to end on, because we've got plenty of time for questions. But join the civil service, and one day you can be one of those permanent secretaries who's a scientist that Angela was talking about. That's the trick.
Please come and put flowers on my grave.
It's not quite the thought I was trying to get at, but certainly perfectly reasonable to ask. We're going to take questions now. I'm going to take questions in sort of groups of 2 or maybe 3, just in the interest of time. I'm going to ask, when you ask a question, if you could just please say your name and where you're from briefly, and please kind of questions to the point, not life stories. Appreciate it. Sandra's first.
Sandra Stalmia, Centre for British Progress. So I'll be starting a job as an academic doctor in August, and in medicine, most doctors aren't really scientists, but we have these tools to help them sort of use evidence and use science. So we have these pyramids of evidence and critical appraisal checklists that sort of shortcut the way to sort of give them a bit of skills of causal inference, but not the whole 3-4 years of scientific training. Can you see something like that being useful in the civil service?
Fantastic, thank you. And then, gentleman in front.
So Kerry Smith, Office for Investment. I was actually wondering about the Treasury, where the Chief Scientific Advisor would only be a scientist by accident if the person in that job happened to be a scientist. And given the departments do lots and lots of work on evidence and putting all their submissions, what's spending money coming up, and Treasury takes all the decisions. Do you think that is a problem that we don't have a proper CSA in HMT?
And then finally, Rosie, you had a question.
Yes, I did. Sorry. So while I totally agree there's much more to be done in making the policy development process more scientific and robust, but also deploying science more effectively in public policy, is there an inverse of this, which is learning how to adapt the scientific discipline to make it more suitable in political context? So teaching people are coming from outside politics, but from within science, that are of kind of small p political intelligence and understanding how they need to work in departments that have got a mixture of different goals, that some of which are competing and often heavily disputed, which is slightly, actually very different to an academic context.
So I'm gonna phrase it this way. Kirsty's got a great question about my alma mater, the Treasury, about how you can get kind of, particularly like the right kinds of people into these jobs in institutions where it's a bit more fraught, and then two very different perspectives on kind of the skills, the tools that we might give people to be doing better science in government, be it kind of from an applied discipline or kind of politics and policy. And maybe you'll take those notes.
So first of all, we do have a proper CSA in Treasury. Jessica is doing a fantastic job. We do lean in really heavily there for precisely the reasons you outlined. So we've actually, most of my work since January actually has been about preparing work for Treasury, about the SR bids. So I would say that's working absolutely fine. As you know, that, interestingly, I found out the other day that role is almost a surefire role to being a permanent secretary, which I didn't know. We await Phil, the permanent secretary. I think one day, I said at the beginning, one day we would like all CSAs to be external scientists. We are delighted with the CSA we have in the Treasury at the moment, and the last one too. What we need is for them to be really interested in science, really ready to lean in and help us scientists across the piece, not just the CSAs, make a strong case for science. And also, be very clear in explaining to all of us how to work with Treasury. When I have breakfast with science and engineering fast streamers and ask them, can't you get a role in the Treasury? And the answer is no, my little heart does weep. Because I think Treasury has its own fast stream. So I think more porosity in Treasury would be a good thing. I think in general I absolutely agree with you, and I would love to see it be for the science and engineering fast stream. And I suspect they would say to me, "Oh, Treasury, do I have to go to Treasury?" And I would say, "Yes, follow money." I am going to come to your question. I was once, one part of my life I was having spent a lot of time in sweaty gym halls whilst one of my children was doing some childish kind of sport. And I wasn't allowed to watch, so I had to sit in corners on my own. And at that point, my department was deeply in the red. And I managed to persuade somebody to give me the spreadsheet that was, what was it called? It's called the resource allocation model, it was called. It was the model that, it was basically the spreadsheet, the Excel spreadsheet that took all the money in, ran a pretty straightforward zero-sum game, and decided which department got which money. I think there were 2 people in university who understood this thing, and I became one of them, basically because I had all this time on my hands. And the power of understanding how that model worked. So that's the story I tell to people who look a bit glum and say, well, do I have to go to Treasury? The answer is yes, go to Treasury. I don't understand why there, or maybe there is a long queue of young civil servants trying to get into Treasury. You can tell me that later over tea. Different models. My parents are both doctors and would disagree that they're not scientists. So I'm having a bit of a sort of dissonance here. So let's call them science practitioners in the sense of applied science practitioners. And I think that's a really interesting thought. I've not thought of that. I think that's a very interesting idea. So ways of we tried to do that, don't we? And we have this the Magenta book that's about evidence and evaluation. Clearly, we need to do more. And your idea, and I'd actually be very interested to hear more about the sorts of tools you think would be useful. And absolutely, this is a two-way street. This is not about a whole bunch of people who don't have science degrees learning some science. It is also about a whole bunch of people with science backgrounds understanding various things. So there's the easy one, which is science ought to be part of the answer, but it is not the answer. I think most of us understand that. But there's the much more complicated and interesting one, I think, which is about consensus building and getting to the right answer with. I sort of talked earlier about the arts of being a brilliant civil servant. I think I at least find quite hard. I mean, I've been here for 5 years, but I look at people who are really good at getting things agreed across multiple departments, and I think, what is it you're doing? So that, in a way, I think is the thing. I would love to see more of our existing scientists and our real civil servant scientists basically being coached, because I mean those are really the people who are going to become diploma savers. So at the moment, I don't think we're doing enough to what's a nice word, to help the civil servants who are already scientists make it to the top.
That's great. Thank you. And yes, the lady there, and then Adam there, and then I'll take Carl. That one.
Hi, I'm Lucy Moore. I'm the head of the Evaluation Task Force in the office. You mentioned that you see your role as trying to get science into decision making in government. I was wondering if you think which is the bigger of the two problems, that we have the evidence but we're not using it in decision making, or that we're not generating the evidence, so we're not testing government policies and programs as we go to see whether they're working.
Okay, great. And then Adam.
I suppose related to that one, Adam Bayliss-West, Department of Business and Trade. A number of times in my career, you come into this position where you think, gosh, wouldn't it be great to have some transactional data in this space that's being generated, whether it's crime or regulatory policy or whatever. It's often quite difficult to persuade senior civil servants and ministers to invest in gathering data when even that gathering exercise, let alone the insights you're going to derive from it, are going to deliver beyond the political horizon. So I just wondered if you had any insights around making those arguments, or whether actually the answer is to try and grab the low-hanging fruit when you can and pick things that will deliver sooner than that.
And then Carl.
I'm Clara Green, DWP. My team's actually called Human-Centred Design Science. We blend design and science, and I was just thinking when you were saying about consensus building skills in science, like that's precisely one of the bridges that I'm building. But that's not my question, though we're more than happy to talk about it. My question is actually about questions. I've noticed that we have wonderful analysts who can answer a wonderful variety of questions, but the amount of time we spend crafting the right question is an undervalued skill, and that's what I think I've asked my scientists to spend most of their time doing. And so, yeah, your thoughts on that.
Some very good sort of meta questions about the process of evidence analysis. I'm gonna maybe kind of bucket your two as kind of is there a hack to getting the data collection right and going and getting the things we need, which kind of helps us work around some of the day-to-day pressures? And then Carl's question about good questions, how we craft those, and query formulation.
I think the issue is that if we have the data, it is not in a state that we can use it easily. That's been my experience. And I guess that's sort of been my academic experience too. So my academic background is an infectious disease modeller. Really what a model really is doing is helping you figure out how to put various different sorts of data in order to answer a good question. And it's, even within a department, my experience was it's fantastically difficult to assemble the data you need, even if somebody thinks they might have it somewhere. And I mean, one of the things that can be very heartbreaking is when you realise actually the data it's not been sold, it's been given away. Or you bought the piece of kit, but in the process of trying to make it expensive, you didn't buy the data module. So, this thing's gathering data like nobody's business, but you haven't paid for it and you're not allowed to have it. I think the low-hanging fruit is a great idea. And I am born optimistic, hopeful that some of the early missions work is going to do that. I'm not sure. Lord Balance has this project called the R&D MAP, Accelerator? Anyway, yes, Missions Accelerator Programme, which is looking at bits of R&D that can quickly sort of add value to the missions programmes. As it turns out, perhaps not surprisingly, the first 4 of those are very sort of data analysis type projects. And done well, those, I think, will do a great job of showing to mission boards, look, it's worth doing this. It is difficult. I mean, you know, getting data from multiple different sources and putting it together is difficult. But if you get the question right, it can help you do your job much better. Turning to, I couldn't agree more. What's the question? Should always be the first question. What's the question? Is that the right question? Why are you asking a question that way? What are you afraid of? Or what is the opportunity? I completely agree, and that's not a science thing. That's again, I think that's a taking the time thing. Or I mean, of course, you know, that's what academics do. In order to be a successful academic, you have to be really good at picking good questions. I'm just trying to think. That is not the thing I recognise in brilliant civil servants, interestingly. And that's making the question, am I not seeing it? Or is it that the questions are somehow set, and then it's the consensus building that's important? Perhaps we need a cup of tea.
Fantastic. All right, we'll take 3 more questions. Yeah, lady at the back.
Hi, I'm Cara Hansen, London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'm also a Programme Director in NIHR. And so there's this space around questions, and that space between a policy problem and a research process to address it seems to me to be that there is a big gap there, and time is part of the answer. I don't have time to work through, but I wonder if there are any models for that engagement that moves from a problem to a question that you think are working particularly effective in government. So, for example, the policy research units that sort of serves with the Department of Health and Social Care, or other types of processes. I wonder if you could speak to the models you think are working best.
So, June, if I may, I'll pick you. I'll go to June's world. Is this medicine safe? Does it work, and is it safe? So that's the policy question. And we're about 100 years in, we're pretty flipping clear what we demand for the answer. And then, of course, there is, I've always thought, the fortunate situation, which is that the people who make the medicine have money and a strong incentive to show that it's clear, so show that it's safe and effective, so we can set up a rather rigorous data requirement, and they pay for it. And so, therefore, what June has to do is be the gatekeeper and the absolute arbiter of, well, is that data good enough? Collectively, over the years, we've decided what is good enough, but you know, what data do we require? So we have this whole complicated system, you know, trial after trial after trial, and then post-licensing and everything like that. And then there is the money in the system, at least for some medicines, to pay for the gathering and presentation of that data. So lots of things have gone right there to make that system work. June, I don't know if you want to tell me why I'm wrong.
I'd like to build on that. June Rain, recently of the Regulatory Authority for Health Technologies and Medicines. There is a big question, I think, about how well the civil service, and that includes our organisation, actually harnesses science and evidence outside, whether it be industry or universities, the research environment, such as the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine. I think it's one of those issues you addressed in your pro-innovation regulation of technology report, and it'd be really good to have some more thoughts about how a regulator retains independence and yet actually engages effectively and harnesses all the resources that are out there.
Do you want to come back on that?
Yes.
Yeah.
No, I don't, especially not now. That's a very complicated question. But so, does it work? Sorry. Does it work? Is it safe? Are 2 sort of fairly straightforward questions. Let's have a think. I mean, does it work? Is a pretty ubiquitous question for anybody who's making policy, and our tolerance for things that don't work or aren't safe. Well, our tolerance for things that aren't safe is very low in medicine. We're not that bothered about things that don't work, right? V-Day, all kinds of things that people pay for that don't work. But I think, well, the cheapest way for government to save money is to stop doing things that don't work. So we should do more of that. And I think perhaps that's part of the answer to your question, is if ministers understood that actually they'd save a lot of money if we found out wasn't working and stopped doing it. That would be a good thing. But, sorry, one last thing. Of course, medicine has the great joy that the unit of study is an individual human, of whom we have plenty. And for many, many questions, the unit of study will be a community, or the experimental design will be much more difficult, and probably much more expensive. And there isn't a drug company. I mean, this is an issue that for interventions where there's nothing to sell, who's going to pay to gather the data?
Feels like a relevant question for the Treasury in the upcoming spending review, but we don't touch too much. We've probably got time for a couple more questions. I'm not seeing a lot of hands going up. But yeah, jump in.
So Chris Biggett from PA. So I'm a closet scientist. I was a scientist. Now I'm in consultancy. So I find that the ability to do analytical thinking on things and the need for evidence slows down decision making, because you want to make the right decision as a person. So do you feel that whilst some people look to leaders and they want them to make decisions relatively quickly, there is a bit of a challenge between those two things? Do you think the scientists moving from making the right view and getting the right data to being someone who's a leader, there's a slight challenge there, and is there anything we can do about it?
I've seen this particularly in sort of evidence gathering, evidence summary work. So that was something I was very interested in as an academic. So sort of putting together really just sort of lists of here are the things we know. And it turns out that's actually used to be very, very time consuming. And if a policymaker comes to you and says, could you find me the evidence on, let's try and think of something, well, I'm trying to think of something looking like, anyway, it doesn't matter. Can you find me the evidence on does X harm Y? And you say, yes, I'll be back in 6 months. They're kind of like, oh, no, forget it. But of course, that is no longer the case. That sort of combing of an existing literature base and summarising it is becoming automatable. That's the sort of work that really is automatable now, and we ought to be doing that. We're not actually, although I know there are calls around the bazaars for that. So I think that should become possible in the next year or so. I don't think that carefully thinking about the evidence slows down good decision making. I think it might, because it can stop bad decision making. So. And sometimes you have to think very fast, sometimes you have to use the evidence you've got and admit that you're not going to get any more evidence. One of the things we talk about actually is being savvy, frankly, about what questions are going to come up. Because if you talk to people who've been in positions like mine for long enough, they will say, well, actually, the same questions come around again and again. I can guarantee that about 3 days before a spending review is due in, somebody's going to I could give you a list, perhaps I won't do it on camera, the things they'll be asking you.
You can ask
but
afterwards.
I've done 3 now, and I probably, in fact, I better write a little note for my successor, because I won't do another one. But it's the same stuff, and you must have the same thing in your work. There are certain patterns that just repeat. And one of the things you can do is make sure you've got that evidence up, in your pocket for the moment. Oh, what this? Here's one I made earlier. I just don't think. I think fundamentally I don't agree with your thesis that evidence slows down decision making.
So in my experience, sometimes if you're in a delivery environment, the decision is important. If you don't make a decision, it actually reduces productivity in itself. So what you do is you make a decision, but you task someone to check the decision in parallel with it. So then people keep going towards something, and they have a North Star, because without that, sometimes you can lose the leadership side.
Well, I think that's a neat answer.
And on the subject of questions which keep repeating, perhaps a sort of useful part of having a permanent civil service is kind of having a bunch of people paid to think slightly beyond the current time horizon. So an important and useful role for the kind of governance and profession. I'm going to take chair's privilege and ask the last question, because we've had a great evening to sit here and kind of ask you every question with some and expect you to have an answer for us. But you've got a great audience of kind of policymakers and people in the ecosystem. If you could have kind of one question on your mind which you think people should be thinking about, people should go away and looking at, and no one clearly is, perhaps even an enterprising think tank that works on public policy. What's the thing that feels to you like an unanswered or important question on this theme that that just maybe is a bit of a wicked problem, you know, it's kind of not going away, or is a new problem in Bear's study?
It's how could we persuade the civil service that taking time out, perhaps as much as half a day a week or half a day a month, to spend listening to what each other is doing is not a waste of time. So, you know, we have all these jokes about how all academics do is they fly around the world talking to each other about what they do. That is what academics do, and the reason they do that is so that you nearly have everybody moving at the speed of the fastest one. And we don't do that in the civil service. We don't spend very much time. You know, there isn't a sort of quantum physics seminar once a week up the road somewhere. There's plenty of people in lots of different departments working on quantum. They know each other, so they are a community. But there isn't a sort of, the thing I really miss is the seminar culture. So how do we build that?
Something perhaps we could facilitate a bit more of in the future. But that's all we've got time for. So all that's left to do is say thank you so much, Angela, for coming and giving us your time. And thank you for coming. And I think the tea, coffee and refreshments will be